Welcome to your personal deep dive. Today, we're diving into something that's got me thinking lately. You know, what makes a podcast sound like really professional? What takes it from meh to wow?
Ooh, I like where this is going.
I think it's all about editing, the magic behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
And you know what? You sent over some awesome articles on this, and this one, editing your podcast. Day 6, this is gold. I'm ready to get my hands dirty. Well, metaphorically speaking, of course. What about you?
Let's do it. It's amazing how much we take, like, polished audio for granted as listeners. It's like you're not supposed to notice the cuts in a good movie. You just feel the flow.
Exactly. So how does this whole invisible art of editing even work? This article starts off saying it's way more than just, cutting out flubs.
Oh, for sure. It's really about shaping the experience. You're taking raw audio and making it not just understandable, but, enjoyable to listen to.
So it's like you're crafting a journey for our ears.
You got it. The article talks about trimming, normalizing audio, getting rid of those filler words, even adding music and sound effects. Each one's like a little piece of the puzzle.
This is already blowing my mind, thinking about my favorite podcasts in a whole new light. Let's break down some of those elements.
Let's start with trimming. Imagine listening to someone ramble on with ums and ahs all over the place.
Painful.
Right. Trimming tightens everything up, keeps you hooked.
Like cutting the boring parts of a story.
Exactly. Then there's normalizing audio. Think of a normalized track like a river, nice and steady.
Okay, I can visualize that.
Unnormalized audio, on the other hand, that's a flash flood, all over the place.
And nobody wants their ears assaulted by random volume changes.
For real. And then we've got those filler words, the ums and ahs. They sneak into everyone's speech, right?
Oh, tell me about it. I feel like I'm the queen of,
We all do it. But in a podcast, too many can be really distracting. A good editor cleans those up without you even noticing.
It's like they're audio ninjas. Now, this article also talks about 2 software options, Audacity and GarageBand. I've heard of those.
Great starting points, and this article actually gets into the nitty-gritty of comparing them, which I appreciate. So Audacity free, open source, perfect for beginners.
And I've heard it's pretty powerful.
Oh, it is. It gives you so much control. If you want to really geek out on the technical stuff, Audacity lets you do that.
And then there's GarageBand. Super user-friendly, right? Especially if you're on a Mac.
It is, and it's got this reputation for being simple, but honestly, don't underestimate GarageBand. The tools it has built in, especially for music, are fantastic.
So it's not just a toy. You can get pretty serious with it.
You absolutely can. Honestly, you can get amazing results with either one. It comes down to what you're comfortable with and how deep you want to go. And the best part is this article links to resources for learning both.
Love it when they do that. But let's be real. All this tech talk is great, but what matters is how we actually use it, right? The article lays out the 6-step editing process, which is super helpful.
And it's so practical. It's about actually doing the editing, not just talking about it.
Exactly. Step 1, import your audio. Simple enough. Step 2, normalize those audio levels. Now, you were talking about this earlier. Can you remind us why this one is so crucial?
Okay, think about listening to a podcast where the volume is all over the place. You're constantly adjusting. Right, so distracting.
Ugh, yes. It's the worst.
Normalizing prevents that. It's all about that smooth, consistent listening experience.
Music to my ears. Okay, we've got our smooth, balanced audio. What's next?
Time to tighten up that content. Step 3, trimming. We're cutting out dead air, mistakes, anything that doesn't need to be there,
We're like film editors, but for sound.
basically. But instead of visuals, we're listening for those spots where the audio should flow. And sometimes it's not as obvious as a big mistake, It's about developing an ear for those little pauses that drag the energy down.
But how do I know what to cut?
Uh-huh.
Question coming on. How do you spot that dead air?
It's a good question. It's like, think about if you were having this conversation in person. Are there any spots where your mind might wander a little?
Wow. Yeah.
It's subtle, but you start to develop a feel for it.
This is making me realize how much work goes into making these conversations sound effortless. Okay, step 4.
Step 4. Those filler words we were talking about, the ums, the ahs, they're natural in conversation, but on a podcast, they can be like visual clutter in a photo. Your eye goes right to the flaw.
I see what you mean. And I'm guessing step 5 is where we get to have a little fun.
You know it. Step 5, it's time for intro and outro music. Now, technically, this is optional, but...
But it makes such a difference.
Right. Just a simple intro and outro elevates the whole thing. It's like adding a frame to a picture. And think about how many podcasts you recognize just from the music alone.
So true. It sets the whole tone. Okay, we've trimmed, we've normalized, we've added some tunes. What's left?
Time to share it with the world. Step 6 is exporting your audio. This is where you turn all your hard work into something people can actually listen to.
And this is where it gets technical again, right? The article mentioned different file types, like MP3 versus WAV.
Exactly. It's one of those things people don't always think about, but it affects file size, quality, it all matters.
So, like, what's the difference?
Think of an MP3 like a zip file. It shrinks things down, which is convenient, but you lose a little bit of quality.
So, like, choosing between a high-res photo and a smaller web version.
Perfect analogy. Now, WAV file, that's like the original uncompressed image. All the detail is there.
This is way more evolved than I thought. So how do you decide?
It's about finding that balance, you know? Quality versus convenience. For most podcasters, especially starting out, an MP3 is just fine.
It's all about balance. I love it. This has been so insightful already, and we haven't even gotten to the hands-on part. I think we need to take a pause here and give our listeners a chance to digest all this awesome info. We'll be back in a flash for more of your deep dive.
And we're back with your deep dive into podcast editing. You know, before we were talking about MP3s and WAVs, and it really got me thinking about all the stuff that goes into a podcast that we, as listeners, never even think about.
It's true, right? We usually just focus on what we're hearing, the content itself, but how it's delivered, the sound quality, the pacing, even the file type, it all makes a difference.
It's all connected. And speaking of getting hands-on, I love that this article doesn't just talk about editing. It actually challenges you to try it yourself.
Yeah.
Find a 5-minute audio clip and just go for it. I have to admit, I'm kind of itching to give it a shot.
Seriously, the best way to learn is by doing. Editing's a skill, just like anything else. Practice makes perfect.
It does sound kind of fun, honestly, like putting together a puzzle but with sound. Any tips for finding good practice clips? Oh, tons. There are websites with free audio clips, even royalty-free music you can use. Or even cooler, why not use your own recordings?
Oh, I like that.
Voice memos, a chat with a friend, doesn't matter if it's perfect. Just get in there and play around with the editing software.
I am so trying that. It's like a behind-the-scenes look at your own life. You know, going through this article, it's making me realize editing is way more creative than I thought.
It totally is. You're making choices that bring this story to life.
Speaking of stories, I'm curious about something we touched on earlier, music and sound effects. The article mentions them, but I feel like there's a whole other deep dive right there.
Oh, for sure. Music can completely change the vibe of a podcast. It's like setting the scene in a movie. Think about it. A slow, sad song creates a totally different feeling than an upbeat, poppy one.
Right. And it's not just about the mood. It can actually guide your emotions as you're listening. Kind of sneaky, really.
Exactly. Like a dramatic musical cue, suddenly that cliffhanger is way more intense, or a little jingle tells you things are about to get lighthearted.
It's like having your own personal soundtrack. So where do podcasters even find this music? Do they have to, like, hire composers or something?
That's the cool part. There are so many resources out there, even if you're just starting out. Royalty-free music libraries, tons of genres and moods to choose from, orchestral stuff, quirky sound effects, you name it.
So even if you're not a musician, you can still add that extra something.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of a well-placed sound effect, even something subtle. A door creaking open, a little bit of wind, it adds this whole other layer of realism.
That's like painting a picture with sound. I'm realizing this is a real art form, just like anything else.
Yeah.
You're finding the right sounds to tell the story.
You got it. And don't be afraid to get a little weird with it, you know? Sometimes the best choices are the ones you least expect.
That is such good advice. Don't be afraid to break the mold a little. You never know what you might come up with. Okay, I know we've covered a ton of info today. Before we get too deep in the creative weeds, I think it's time for a quick breather. But stick around, folks. We'll be right back with the final part of your podcast editing deep dive. And we are back for the grand finale of our podcast editing deep dive.
Expert speaker, this has been honestly eye-opening. I never realized how much goes into making a podcast sound so, I don't know, polished.
It's like you've unlocked this secret level of listening, you know?
Totally. And speaking of details, we've talked about a lot. Trimming, normalizing, music, sound effects. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you said earlier about like the heart of it all. Creating an experience for the listener. Any final thoughts on how to actually do that?
Ooh, that's the big question. I think it boils down to intentionality. Every choice you make when you're editing, it should be serving the story you're telling, the feeling you want to evoke. So it's not just about making it sound clean. It's about using those techniques to actually make the message better.
Yes, exactly. Think of it this way. You could have the most amazing content, but if it's badly edited, if the audio's all over the place, the pacing is off, the music is distracting,
It'd be like painful to listen to.
it would. It'd be like trying to savor this delicious meal, but you're in this super chaotic environment. You might taste the food, but the experience is ruined.
That's a perfect analogy.
Right. But when you take that time to edit it right, to make it smooth, engaging, you're inviting people in, they connect with your ideas on a whole other level.
It's like you're building a world for them.
Exactly. So it's not just the technical stuff, it's about using those tools to make something special for the listener.
I love that. So what's one piece of advice you'd give someone who's just starting out to find their own way with editing?
Honestly, don't be afraid to play. The great thing about digital audio is you can always undo, redo, try again, experiment. Listen back to your work, and don't be scared to break the rules a little. You never know what you'll discover.
That is such great advice. Play around, find your own sound. Expert speaker, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for all your wisdom.
My pleasure. Have fun editing, everyone.
And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of podcast editing. We hope you learned something new today, maybe even feel inspired to give it a try yourself. Remember, the most important thing is to have fun, experiment, and let your creativity shine. Until next time, happy listening.